But Donald Trump, man, whew, well,
Yeah. Yeah,
I
it's a
kind
lot.
of believe that it needs to be said, but it feels like what needs to be said is like Brown versus Board of Education is still the law of the land.
I'm Kimberly Atkins Stohr, and welcome to Justice by Design, a podcast that points out just that. Justice does not happen on its own. It happens through the deliberate actions of people to ensure that justice reaches all of us. You know, growing up, I often joked that by calling my parents the integrators, because it seemed that every time we moved house, and I grew up in Metro Detroit, we would move house in a way that made us the first, or one of the first at least, Black families on the street. If you've ever seen A Raisin in the Sun, I can so relate because we had some welcoming committees with these moves into predominantly white neighborhoods. That happened since I was a little kid. I was born in Detroit, but grew up in various suburban communities just outside Detroit because of the way my parents moved. And it was only when I was a little older that I realized the reason they did that is because of schools. In my family, my parents valued education very, very highly. And I'm the youngest of six. So when school systems began being under resourced, and in the Detroit metro area, that happened, the blacker the neighborhoods became, the more under resourced these schools became. It was still, even as modest as our middle class life was, better for them to try to stretch a penny into a dollar and buy a new home in a place where the schools were higher quality than, I don't know, try to send all of us to a private school, something that just they wouldn't have been able to do. And it's amazing that they were able to move the way that they did, but that shouldn't have to happen. That is precisely what the ruling more than 70 years ago by the US Supreme Court, that segregated schools were inherently unequal, that you cannot have separate and equal. But that's something that still persists to this day. And now, as there are new attacks on our education system afoot, I think that there is no better time to have a conversation about this. And that's why I am so glad to be joined today by Ary Amerikaner. She is the co founder and executive director of Brown's Promise. Ary, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. This is just, it's a delight to be here under challenging circumstances nationally, but this is critical work and I can't wait to get into it.
Yes, so I do want to get into it, but first, I would love for you to introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners. Tell us about your work in the education space and about the work of Brown's Promise.
Sure. Well, I am, I guess, first and foremost, a human who lives here in Montgomery County, Maryland, where my two little girls go to diverse, wonderful public elementary schools that we adore, and I think that's an important perspective to bring to the conversation. I, in addition to being a mom with real kids and real lives, am a longtime education policy nerd. To be precise, I have had, I guess, at this point, coming up on, I'll say, more than 15 years of experience in the education policy world, both inside and outside of government. I worked in the Obama administration in the second term in the Department of Education, where I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, which is a lot of words. But it was an incredible opportunity to serve the country there. And that is where I met Saba Biretta, who is my co-founder at Brown's Promise. She was working as a senior political appointee in the Office for Civil Rights, and she also worked in the Office of General Counsel during that time. So we met in the Obama administration, and that's how we started our story and started our conversation that turned into Brown's Promise. I will just briefly also share that since being in the Obama administration, I have spent some time at the Education Trust, which is a national nonprofit that does education advocacy and education equity sort of writ large. I led the P12 team there. I was there for about 5 years, a little shy of 5 years. And then I spent a little time at the Maryland State Department of Education, where I was the chief of staff. And after leaving that job, Saba and I came back together to talk about forming and then actually forming and launching Brown's Promise, which I would be remiss if I didn't sort of note that we are housed at the Southern Education Foundation. So Brown's Promise has only been around for 2 years, so we are still in sort of startup, nimble, fun building mode. But we have the incredible luxury and benefit and just experience of being housed at the Southern Education Foundation, which is has been around for over 150 years. They've been fighting these fights for education equity and racial justice, particularly in the South, but across the country for a very long time. And so we just could not be more grateful to Raymond Pierce and the whole team there for having us. So in the last 15 years, as I've been doing education equity work and education policy work, I have developed some specialty and some expertise in the school finance world. So my background for the last 15 years has been, how do we fund schools better and more fairly? How do we try to break that link that we all sort of know exists about the zip code and the wealth of the neighborhood that you're born into and the funding available to support public schools in that neighborhood? How do we break that link? How do we fund schools more fairly, right? That's been the question that I've been most obsessed with and most sort of grappling with and trying to move the ball on for the last 15 years.
Well, that's a really, really important and foundational question, because I think people don't realize everything that goes into the quality of education in our schools. They do know the concept of Brown v. Board of Education, but one reason I love the name of your organization is the promise of that has never been fulfilled. In fact, in the 70 plus years since that decision was passed, it's really been eroded away. And one big erosion took place at the Supreme Court in a case out of Detroit, which is why I care so very much about this, which essentially held that, yes, we don't think that separate, and I'm paraphrasing the court, we don't think that separate can be equal, but you can't force surrounding communities to be a part of a solution when you have a segregated school district. And in this case, growing up in Detroit, I could see it with my own eyes. It was an incredibly, and still is, an incredibly segregated metropolitan area. At the time, Detroit was one of, if not the blackest city in America by population. For a while, we were piggybacking back and forth with Gary, Indiana, for that. That isn't the case anymore, but it was for a very long time. And the suburbs were, some of them were lily white. And the minute that folks like my parents would start to move into them, redlining would force other people of color into that area to turn it primarily black or brown, leaving the lily white suburbs intact. And that created this discrepancy. You would have one town with very poorly funded schools right next to a wealthier town that had amazing schools and a very high college acceptance rate. And that's what my parents were fighting. But the Supreme Court said essentially that that was okay. Can you tell us a little bit how that really set up the situation for the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is just an incredible story, and I'm so glad to find someone else who is so interested in it, because
Yes.
there aren't that many of us in the world. So I think the one important thing in understanding Milliken is, at the very highest level, the way we talk about it is, if Brown versus Board was the sort of green light for integration efforts in America, it is not that much of an oversimplification or an exaggeration to say that Milliken was really like the red light in terms of forward progress.
Yeah.
It was only 20 years later, but the Supreme Court had entirely turned over by the time, almost entirely turned over by the time Milliken showed up at its doors. And so that is, I think, the framework that we talk about Milliken. But I also want to say that I think it's really important to think that, to understand the story of Milliken. And I'm going to give a couple of points, but if you haven't, I'm sure you've already seen this, but everyone should go read The Containment, which
Hmm.
is a new book out by
I
Michelle
literally
Adams.
have a physical copy around here
Oh my gosh,
somewhere.
I genuinely do
It
too. I'm
is
carrying it around with me usually. Yeah.
this is a live podcast moment, y'all, where I literally reached over to the other side of my room and got the containment to show you guys. I'm in the middle of it. You can see I'm bookmarking it. I'm taking notes in it. A wonderful book by Michelle Adams. But go
Yes, it
ahead.
is so worth reading. I feel like I live and breathe this stuff, and yet, like countless times, I was saying out loud to my husband, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know that! I can't believe I didn't know that!" And so, so read the book. But
Yes.
in the short time that we have together, I think it's important to sort of set the stage and realize that this was a case where Black families in Detroit, represented by the NAACP, were like, we know the law of the land. We know that Brown versus Board says that we are entitled to integrated, equal public schools, and we want that. And they started by it started as a conversation about what's happening within Detroit, but it actually quickly became a conversation about the whole region. And one of the side notes that I think is so fascinating that comes from reading her book is that actually one of the reasons that it became not just a within district case, but a regional case, is as is so many bad stories in American history, it was because white families, relatively well off white families, represented by their sort of homeowners interest group in Detroit, got very concerned that their property values were going to go down. They could see the writing on the wall and see they were going to lose in district court, that the judge was on the side of the Black families in the court case. And they started to say, well, then if we have to suffer, quote unquote, by like having our schools integrated and property values go down, then it should be regional, because that would actually like insulate us against more rapid drops in price for our houses, because it wouldn't be so easy to just move across the district line and get a different sort of house where you could flee, you could do white flight. uh, Fascinating twist of history that they are sort of one of the main reasons that this case became a regional interdistrict case. Anyways, NAACP and the Black families win in district court. They win again when the case is appealed up to the appellate court.
Yeah, and
And
just so I can put a finer
yeah,
point on what we're talking about, there was already Supreme Court precedent saying that you could not segregate schools within a district. But then what would happen in communities like Detroit, you have very Black districts next to
right.
very white districts. That's still segregation. So the question became, can you enforce an integration plan across community lines, across different towns and cities within a metropolitan area in Detroit? So like me, I my parents, when I was a baby, moved from Detroit to Oak Park, which was right just north of Detroit, which at the time was very white. Would would that had that had there been an integration plan, that may not have been necessary. My siblings, when they were high school age at that time, could have gone perhaps to Oak Park High School, even though they lived in Detroit.
That's right.
So that's what we're talking about.
That's right. Yeah. And there's kind of two big ways to end at that sort of goal that you were just talking about. One would be a bigger school district. So,
Mm-hmm.
like a county-wide school district, for example, so that these little tiny school districts didn't exist at all. Or if you're going to maintain the tiny little school districts, an integration plan that explicitly allows for inter-district enrollment
Mm-hmm.
for families, regardless of which side of the line they happen to live on. And both of those are strategies that have been used and tried and worked and not worked in different places in this ongoing effort to do school integration in our country. And so the Supreme Court ultimately decided against these families, and they differentiated from Brown, and they said the only way to have a federal court requirement that you do inter-district integration, that you do multi-district regional integration, is if you can show that each individual district involved intentionally segregated their schools
Yeah.
on the basis of race. You're only allowed to use race to solve a problem if the state actor, in this case the school district, each individual school district, intentionally discriminated on the basis of race to create the segregation. And uh, they were not able to show that in the way that was compelling to the court, let me say. I
Right.
mean,
Right.
Michelle Adams goes into a ton of amazing detail about how the housing patterns were very much government action and were very intentional, but that is not how the
Absolutely.
court interpreted it, the Supreme Court in 1974. So 20 years to the year after Brown was decided in Milliken, the Supreme Court said, we're not going to tell federal courts they can require multi-district solutions to this problem of
And
school
and
integration.
and in so doing, they kind of, I have to say, just the when I'm talking about my parents moving from Detroit to a suburb, they did so in 1974, and I don't
Wow.
think that that was a coincidence. But um, they were essentially creating more fair education opportunities for everyone, more equal education opportunities for everyone as some sort of punishment, and saying, well, if this white city did not segregate Detroit, if it's not their fault, why should they have to pay? That essentially was the rationale. I mean, when you cut through it,
That's right.
that's exactly what they were saying. And that really, at the just 20 years in, really took a lot of the feet from under Brown. And so we still see these persistent created patterns of segregation on large and small levels that really prevent the true meaning of Brown v. Board of Education from becoming a reality to this day. So, Ary, I just want to fast forward a little bit to now because we know that this has been a pressing problem. I met you through Saba, who I've done events with and been talking to and interviewed and really was focusing about on the education crisis, which is largely a funding crisis in America before the change in administration and the new threats to totally dismantle the Department of Education, for example. So, kind of put this existing problem into today's perspective. And then we'll get to what some of those solutions, what is some of the solutions to these problems are. But I just want to sort of get your view on where we are in this moment.
Yeah. Well, let's do this moment, but let's actually start it where we just left off in Detroit. So
Sure.
in Detroit, in this moment,
Hmm.
schools are wildly segregated.
Yes.
And this is not just a problem from 1974.
Yep.
We broadly in America and families in Detroit are currently living with very high levels of school segregation.
Hmm.
This is going to sound a little wonky, but if you bear with me for just a second, there's a one way of measure. There's lots of ways to measure segregation in schools, but one of the ways that is the most compelling to me measures how different is the sort of average student of Group A's school. How different is that than the average student in Group B? So, for example, when you look at white-black segregation in Detroit, in the Detroit area, the Detroit region as a whole,
Hmm.
it is one of the highest in the country. It is insane. It is 0.7, and the highest you can get is 1. So if it were 1, it would mean that literal de jure legally segregated, nobody's going to school together, and they're at 0.7. So that is wild. That
Hmm.
is so high, and almost 100% of it is coming between district lines. So just like the families were saying in Milliken v. Bradley, there's almost nothing that Detroit can do by itself. And I want to make this clear, there's also almost nothing that most of the surrounding suburbs can do by themselves. If they realize, and some districts have realized, that this isn't a punishment, this is good for all kids, it's
Yeah.
good for white kids too, and none of them can get to the benefits of diversity without doing something across those district lines because of the way the way the facts are right now. So that's true around the country. Detroit is an extreme example, but around the country today, schools are as segregated as they were in the early 1970s. And they're getting worse. It's going in the wrong direction. And 60 some percent of that segregation is between district lines. So that's kind of just like where we are today in this very moment. That's where we were before Donald Trump took office.
Hmm.
That's the sort of status quo of where we live. And it's different in different states. If you're in a southern state where you have bigger county-wide school districts, often more of the problem is within a district. But in across the country, about two-thirds, a little less than two-thirds of the segregation is between district lines. So that's just a preview of where I think the solutions lie is around those district lines. But Donald Trump, man, whew, well, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
I
It's a
kind
lot.
of believe that it needs to be said, but it feels like what needs to be said is like Brown versus Board of Education is still the law of the land, and its progeny, parents involved in community schools, was a big court case in 2007
Yes.
that sort of interpreted and brought into more modern day what remedies are allowed in doing school integration. And for some people, it was considered a setback because it
Hmm.
said that you couldn't use individual students' race to do student assignment, except
Yes,
for
a very John Roberts-esque approach that,
except for yeah,
if the only way to get rid of racism is just to ignore racism when that,
right.
in fact, is
Although
not.
although
Yes.
picks today is incredibly important, and we should all do our I think we would all do ourselves a real service if we went back and read it and looked
Hmm.
at it. And I actually wanted to, if it's okay, I wanted to just
Yes.
read one little paragraph. Now where is it? Let's see if I can find it. So Justice Kennedy wrote the concurring and like controlling opinion in
Yes,
picks,
he did.
and it is still the law of the land to this day. And what he said was, school boards may pursue the goal of bringing together students of diverse backgrounds and races through other means, meaning not specific race based assignment, including strategic site selection of new schools, drawing attendance zones with general recognition of the demographics of neighborhoods, allocating resources for special programs, recruiting students and faculty in targeted fashion, and tracking enrollments, performance, and other statistics by race. These mechanisms are race conscious but do not lead to different treatment that tells each student he or she is to be defined by race. So it is
Mm.
unlikely any of them would demand strict scrutiny or that would be needed to be found permissible. And then he says that governments, which for generations now have considered these types of policies and procedures, should be permitted to employ them with candor and with confidence that a constitutional violation does not occur whenever a decision maker considers the impact a given approach might have on students of different races. And
Mm.
I just like, it gives me some amount of hope, and it feels important to me to ground ourselves in that is the most recent statement by the Supreme Court of the United States about what is allowed in this work. And it is crazy to compare that to the stuff that's coming out of the Trump administration, both in executive order and then like in just as recent as Friday, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights sent out a Dear Colleague letter that um, is basically a ransom note that tells school districts and colleges and universities that if they even think about diversity, essentially, they may be putting their federal funds in jeopardy, and
Yeah.
gives them 14 days to comply with, I don't know, this thought police idea that they have.
And if that were to actually happen, if the federal government not just did not encourage for this principle that you laid out from Justice Kennedy, these parameters, these almost a roadmap, right, of things that can be done. If the federal government prohibits that, what does that mean in terms of access to education?
It means that they will have in some ways succeeded in their goal of making America segregated again, right? I
Hmm.
mean, that's not what they're saying, and I'm not trying to be like cutesy. I think they
No.
absolutely want to return to a time in American history that was pre-civil rights movement,
Yeah.
that is an actually segregated space. And I think it is important to remember that the reason they want that, among many other reasons, but one is to facilitate under resourcing historically marginalized and underserved communities, right? Like if just to oversimplify, obviously segregation is not a black and white issue in this country at all anymore, if it ever
Sure.
was. But if black students and white students are going to different schools, it's very easy to under-resourced the Black schools. And we know that in our country, green follows white, and it shouldn't be that way, but it is that
Yes.
way. And so we have to recognize that
Yes.
the goal of integration has never been sitting next to white kids. The goal of integration has always been access to resources. And I think they are the Trump team, and the sort of efforts that are coming out of this administration. It's very clear that they are trying to get us back to that
Yes.
space.
And beyond that, I mean, I think you're spot on, but not only does green follow white, white wants to bring that green into charter schools and into religious schools, which the Supreme Court seems increasingly eager to do. And I really do. I'm so glad that you read that section of Kennedy's concurrence in Parents Involved. But remember, it was also Anthony Kennedy that was the only reason that affirmative action held on to the tiniest thread that it held on to. As the minute he left the court, that was gone.
Yeah.
So this is a different court than even a Republican nominated and confirmed lifelong Republican jurist was
That's
on.
true.
And
But
so I
and
worry. But go ahead. No, push back,
well, sorry, I
please.
didn't mean to cut you off, but I
No.
think it's also really important to say that, like, that's right. And as recently as last year, with this exact Supreme Court, the right wing, sort of very well funded special interest groups brought two cases to the Supreme Court's door designed to overturn PICS, the thing I was just reading from, right? It was both Thomas Jefferson in high school in Virginia and the Boston Community Schools, I think it is, in Boston. And both of those schools were doing race neutral things to try to promote the diversity of the student body writ large. And they were essentially following Kennedy's outline about things that were allowed. And they, Kennedy, yeah. And I was like, wait, which justice? And then they were told, and then the right wing group sued them, and the Supreme Court denied cert. They said, no, we don't want to hear it. We don't want to so I will say, like, obviously we're living in a time where unreasonable optimism is naive, but I think we should decide to hold on to where we actually are. Like, let's focus on where we actually are. And I think where we actually are is this Supreme Court was not interested just last year in changing the law of the land in this particular context. And so
that's a really important point. That is an important point, and that's a great segue into where I want to go now, which is what needs to be done. What do you need for the work of Brown's Promise to succeed, and what is the solution? Is there anything that our listeners can do? I know I'm almost always asked, what can we do?
Yeah.
So I want to, what do you need? What does this nation need? What can you and our listeners do?
Well, at Brown's Promise, we are working on restarting a conversation in America about the benefits of school integration and school diversity. And I don't mean to say that we are solely doing that. There are incredible groups who have been doing this work forever. I mean, most notably among them, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, who is just an incredible giant and leader in this space. And we've been so fortunate that they've been willing to work with us a little on things, and that they've been great partners. And so I certainly don't mean to say that, to imply that this work hasn't already been happening. But I will say, as somebody who's been in the sort of middle of a lot of the recent sort of ed reform, ed equity, education advocacy, sort of mainstream conversations, I will say that very few people in those spaces talk about school integration or school diversity. They talk about access to school funding, they talk about access to diverse teachers, great educated, stable, quality teachers, access to advanced coursework, all things that I believe in deeply and that we believe in at Brown's Promise. They very infrequently talk about the ways that school segregation is keeping us from achieving any of those goals in a meaningful way. Mm-hmm. And so our goal is to integrate, for lack of a better word, those two conversations about access to resources on the one side, money, but also all those other things that we know make a great school, and school integration on the other side. Because frankly, I often say that to my school funding colleagues who are skeptical of the school diversity work and the school integration work. I say, any day that we spend advocating for more money in high poverty schools and districts is a good day. Like, and we should, and in schools and districts that serve high concentrations of students of color, like that have been so long underfunded in America, like that's a good day, and we should keep doing that work. But I've been doing that work for 15 years now, and if we don't, what we do as a community is we say la 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 la, we stick our fingers in our ears and we ignore the policies and the lines and the reasons that those districts and schools exist in the first place. We don't have to have schools with very high concentrations of poverty. We don't have to have districts that are totally racially isolated in any direction. Like, we don't have to have that and then fund our way out of it.
Yeah.
And frankly, we aren't funding our way out of it. We never will fund our way out of it because of the way electoral math works.
Right.
Research shows that we would have to spend 2 or 3 times as many dollars in high poverty districts and schools if we
Yeah.
were going to give separate but equal educational opportunities.
Yeah.
And we've never done that. Even in the most progressive of states where they do spend more money in high poverty schools and districts, none of them are anywhere close to spending 2 to 3 times as many dollars.
Yeah.
It's just never been done. So all that is to say, like, part of what you can do and part of what we can all do, I think, as listeners and as just people who live in our communities, is start to take notice of how segregated are our schools. Like, go look at your school, go ask your school board members, or go ask your school superintendent, like, can you just show me like a simple graph that shows me like all the elementary schools in our district and what percent of them are students living in poverty,
Mhm.
and like overall how much money per student is getting spent at each one of those. And I bet what you will find is that some of them are really high poverty, some of them are really low poverty, and they're all spending almost exactly the same dollars per student.
Yeah.
So go ask those questions, ask to see that data, and start a conversation. I mean, you don't have to be an expert to say, like, that doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah.
Like, if there's a lot more need over here, why aren't we putting more money over here? Or why aren't we mixing up the students? Like, there are a lot of solutions that are out there, but we have to start by even just asking the question to like raise up that this is a problem and that this is something that we don't want to live with as a community and as a group. So that is I think what like people can do at a sort of baseline level.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I don't want to give the impression at all that my parents just like, they're like, oh, it's bad now, let's pick up. And no, everybody in the board of the school board, the principals, the superintendent knew my mom on a first name basis. Like, she was up in there, an active part of efforts to save the schools. She did everything she can until there was nothing left to do but protect her own children.
Yeah.
And when she moved into new communities, she again was a regular at school board meetings. She always knew the principal and the superintendent of all my schools, which was really annoying, by the way. But she was that kind of parent. She knew what programs were available. She knew what was getting cut. She made her voice known about it. She wasn't just advocating for me and my 5 siblings. She was advocating for the school and the community as a whole. And parents have or even if you're not a parent, you're a taxpayer, you can do it. They have such sway in these situations. And it's worth noting that the minute that she left, we moved to a different community. She would note at how many programs were discontinued at my private school and in our private town. So it does make a difference to make your voice heard.
That's so well said. And it is so important to be able and willing to go that one extra step. So it is hard enough to find the time. I know as a parent, it is hard enough to find the time to go to a school board member or a school board meeting at all. And then once you do, the only thing you feel, or I often feel like it is fair to feel like the only thing you're sort of qualified to ask for is, or ask about, is what's happening in your kid's school.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that we have to push beyond that and be willing to ask about the system and how are they, because they aren't just like a glorified school principal. They're the superintendent. They are supposed to be looking across their schools at the whole system and thinking about how are we assigning students to schools and how are we assigning resources to meet their needs. And that is uniquely a thing that the school district or the state Department of Education can do. Those are the levers that only they can really pull. And so we have to ask them about it. We have to ask them how they're pulling it. How are they actually making sure that students' needs are being met, and recognizing that student needs are different in different schools, and that they are creating that unequal need, and then they're not taking action to meet that unequal need. So I think like opening that conversation is a really important part. In terms of what we're doing at Brown's Promise, so we are really focused, as I sort of alluded to before, we're really focused on the school district lines as a problem, and that is because they are both responsible for more than half of the problem in terms of levels of segregation, and they are also the revenue raising lines. So school districts are funded as a district, and so that means that if we want to tackle both funding inequities and segregation, district lines is really sort of where it's at. And so we have to think about the ways that district lines are creating the problem, and then we have to think about creative solutions to address that problem. And so we have been working on identifying a whole range of creative solutions that people have tried. These are not like pulled out of our head. These are actual solutions that people have been trying in different ways around the country for a long time now. And we're trying to elevate those creative ideas so that more people know about them. So like, for example, in the 90s, the Nebraska state legislature created something called the Omaha Learning Community. And it was it's really interesting. They have the city of Omaha as its own school district, and then they have 11 school districts that suburban school districts that surround the Omaha City School District. And they had some of the same problems, not to the same degree that we're talking about in Detroit. Mm-hmm. And they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to create a whole new government entity called the Omaha Learning Community. And it's going to sit on top of these 11 school districts. And we're not going to consolidate them. We're not going to create one big, massive school district. But we are going to say that local revenue is now raised across these 11 districts. So there's not local revenue being raised in each individual school district. We're going to all pool our revenue for the local part of our education funding and then allocate it across these 11 districts according to need. They also, in that Omaha Learning Community, created an inter-district enrollment process and provided some additional supports for early learning for students living in poverty. So that was sort of a 3-part stool that was very promising.
Wow.
The political winds shifted, and it's a really interesting story, but the political wind shifted, and like it only lasted for like a decade before it was dismantled. One of the reasons we think that matters is that, well, one, there's a lot of really innovative, good ideas that we should be learning from and exporting. And two, it says to us how important it is to make sure that change is sticky. And I think for us at Brown's Promise, 2 of the most helpful approaches to making change sticky are community engagement. So making sure that like the local community is actually driving what we want. And the second is litigation. Court orders are a great way to make things stick.
Yeah.
And so we like to sometimes contrast the Omaha Learning Community to a different approach in Connecticut, where Hartford, in the Hartford region, they have the longest running inter-district integration effort in the country. It is not perfect. There's lots of complicated challenges to doing this work, but it is by far the longest running and biggest effort in our country. And it has been studied, and it has shown some very positive outcomes for students, both in terms of test scores, but also in terms of things like feeling safe and belonging at school, and fewer teacher absences. It's shown a lot of positive results for a lot of kids, and they're currently serving about 40,000 plus students a year. Their approach is mostly about magnet schools. So like themed, interesting schools that you can enroll in regardless of what school district you live in the area, in the whole region. And they are very explicit that they are designed to promote diversity, and that they are doing so because of a state court order. So again, families in Connecticut sued, and they sued under their state constitution, which is an important difference from what happened in Milliken. They sued under their state constitution, and they won. And ever since then, there's been court orders saying you must provide an integrated access to integrated public schools for students of color in Hartford and in the Hartford region. And that has created that, combined with, I should say, the heroic advocacy of Elizabeth Horton Sheff, who was the named plaintiff in that case. She has been meeting. She's on our advisory board at Brown's
Oh,
Promise. She's incredible to talk to. She's been hosting monthly Sheff movement meetings for community members for more than 20 years.
wow.
They still meet, and they're still fighting this fight. And that combination of community-based advocacy and litigation is what keeps things alive through a lot of hard times and a lot of pushbacks and a lot of mistakes, and like nothing's perfect and they're still
Yeah.
working to make it better. But I think it's a really inspiring example of what can be.
That's so great. That's such a great example, and that's a perfect one to wrap our conversation on, because not only does it show the importance of action on a community level, which is something that anyone can do, but it was so smart to sue as a state action, because it's important for our listeners who are not lawyers to understand that federal courts, generally speaking, cannot step in and substitute their own judgment when a state court rules based on state law. It's very hard to upend that and try to, although including the U.S. Supreme Court, if a challenge ever gets there, that the courts in general in the federal judiciary do not touch state courts ruling on state things.
That's
And
right.
so
And
that
that's
was a
why
really
we're
smart way to go
Yeah,
about it.
that's totally right. So that's the inspiration for all of what we're doing at Brown's Promise. We're working with partners in Massachusetts and in Colorado and in Georgia to try to try to bring similar state constitution based claims, and do that in combination with a policy advocacy, a more traditional sort of policy advocacy agenda. And so that's the other thing you can do, is if you happen to be in one of those states and you're excited about this kind of work, is to go check us out at brownspromise.org and send us a note, and we'd be happy to find ways to connect with folks who are especially, I mean, anybody, but especially in those three states. We are really excited about we're receiving a lot of good feedback from folks who are in those states who are
Yes.
excited about this.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you so much for that work, Ary, and thank you so much for joining me today. This was such an important conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, I really, I'm really glad that Ary brought up the book, The Containment, because reading it was one reason why I wanted to have this discussion, not just because it hits home to me as a native Detroiter and because I know how hard my parents fought for uh, good schools and a good education for me and my sisters and my brother, but because education is such a foundational principle for our democracy. And that's clearly why you're seeing so many attacks on it, not just efforts to ensure that we have schools that are representative of communities, that reach everyone, and that don't leave anyone behind, but also that in our schools we are taught our history and we know where we come from, and there's efforts to stop that as well. So it's important for listeners like you who care about justice to be aware of this, know that you have a part in this fight if you choose to take it, and how powerful you are in ensuring in this space that justice is done. I'm Kimberly Atkins Stohr. Thank you for listening to Justice by Design. I am here every week wherever you get your pods, so make sure you follow the podcast and also give it 5 stars, because that helps other people who are not yet aware of what we're doing over here get to know the podcast, find out about it too. And it helps us grow so that we can bring you more conversations like this. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you next week.